Everyone in Cedar Hollow told Gideon Hale the same thing: burn the orchard down and stop wasting your life. 61 years old, nearly broke, and standing alone in rows of apple trees that hadn't produced a real harvest in 11 years, most men would have listened. But the morning a 12-year-old boy crouched in the grass and said, "Mr. Hale, why don't any bees come here?" Everything changed. That question would cost Gideon almost everything he had left. It would turn his neighbors against him, drag him in front of a county board, and push him to the edge of losing the land his grandfather broke his back to build. And it would give him the only thing that ever mattered. If you've ever been told to give up on something you believed in, stay with me. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story travels. The first thing people noticed about the Hale orchard, if they bothered to notice it at all anymore, was the silence. Not the good kind of silence, not the deep, settling quiet of a place where the world had slowed down enough to breathe. This was the silence of absence, of something missing that you couldn't quite name until you'd stood there long enough to feel it pressing against your skin. No hum, no soft, constant motion in the air. Just rows of apple trees standing in the morning like old men who'd forgotten what they were waiting for, their branches heavy with pink and white blossoms every spring. And every spring, those blossoms falling to the dirt without leaving anything behind. 11 years of that. Gideon Hale knew the silence better than anyone. He'd been waking up before dawn and walking those rows since he was 7 years old, holding his grandfather's hand on one side and his father's on the other, listening to them talk about the trees the way some men talked about their children. Which ones were strong? Which ones needed watching? Which old girl over on the East End had been here longer than anyone alive and would probably outlast them all? Now Gideon walked the rows alone. He was 61, which didn't feel old until he bent down too fast or tried to work a full day in August heat, and then it felt ancient. His hair had gone the color of creek water in November, that flat, pale gray that wasn't quite white. His hands were the hands of a man who'd spent 4 decades outdoors, scarred across the knuckles, permanently stained around the nail beds, the kind of hands that made people uncomfortable if they looked too long. He walked with a slight tilt to the left, the result of a fall off a ladder in 2009 that his hip had technically healed from, but never quite forgiven him for. The orchard was 43 acres. His grandfather, Ernest Hale, had cleared the first 15 himself in 1931, working through the kind of poverty that made current hardship look like inconvenience. He'd planted Honeycrisp and Cortland and an old variety called Roxbury Russet that barely anyone grew anymore, and he'd built the stone wall along the southern edge with his own hands, hauling rock from the creek bed one wheelbarrow at a time. Gideon's father had expanded it twice, once in the 50s, once in the 70s, until the orchard spread across the hillside above Cedar Hollow like a patchwork quilt, visible from half the county on a clear day. At its peak, the Hale orchard had produced 11,000 bushels in a season. Gideon still had the ledger. He kept it in the top drawer of his desk and never opened it, but he knew it was there. Last year's harvest, 412 bushels. Less than 4% of what this land had once given. His wife, Bettina, had died in 2019. They'd had 28 years together and no children, and she'd been the one who kept the books and the one who knew how to talk to people in town without making it feel like she was asking for anything. After she was gone, the farm had felt different in ways Gideon couldn't explain and hadn't tried to. He'd sold off the back 40 acres of pasture land the year before to cover operating costs, and he'd stopped going to the Cattlemen's Association dinners. And he'd started eating supper standing over the kitchen sink because sitting at the table alone felt like something he wasn't ready to get used to. The town had its opinions about all of this. Cedar Hollow was a farming community in the old sense, meaning everyone knew your business, and most of them felt entitled to advice about it. Population 1,100, more or less. There was a grain elevator, a diner, a hardware store, 2 churches, a volunteer fire department, and a historical society that had exactly 3 members and met on the second Tuesday of every month in Norma Bledsoe's front parlor. People had lived here for generations, and generations of people had developed very firm ideas about what worked and what didn't. The verdict on the Hale orchard was in. Time to let it go, Gideon. That was what Harvey Boone told him in the feed store parking lot on a cold morning in March, about 3 weeks before the events that would change everything. Harvey was 64, built like someone had stacked 2 barrels on top of each other and put a hat on the result, and he farmed 300 acres of corn and soybeans to the northeast of town. He'd made money every year Gideon could remember, and he'd made it the way certain men make money, by being correct about things that other people were wrong about, and making sure you knew it. "Those trees are done," Harvey said. He was loading 50-pound bags of mineral supplement into the bed of his truck, doing it easily, barely breaking a sweat. "I know it's hard to hear, but you've been watching them fail for a decade. Cut your losses." Gideon had put his hands in his pockets and looked at the hardware store window behind Harvey's shoulder. "They're still blooming." "Blooming doesn't mean anything if nothing comes of it." "They're alive." Harvey had looked at him then, with the particular expression that Cedar Hollow men got when they thought they were being patient with you. "Alive and productive aren't the same thing. You know that. You farmed your whole life." He heaved the last bag into the truck. "You'd get good money for that timber at least, better than nothing." He'd driven away, and Gideon had stood in the parking lot for a while after, not because he had no answer, but because he had too many. Bam! The boys showed up on an April morning when the blossoms were out in force, and the whole orchard smelled so sweet it almost made you angry. The smell of what should have been, drifting through air that was completely, devastatingly quiet. Gideon was working on the irrigation line in the second row, on his knees in the cold dirt, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned, expecting one of the county road crew who sometimes cut through the property, and found himself looking at a kid, 12, maybe 13. Thin in the way that boys that age get before they grow into themselves, all elbows and big feet and not quite knowing where to put their hands. Dark hair that needed cutting, a pair of rubber boots that were probably his father's based on how they fit. "Can I help you?" Gideon said. "I'm Micah Reed," the boy said. "My mom runs Marlowe's, the diner. I've been riding my bike past here for about 2 weeks." Gideon waited. "The blossoms are really something," Micah said. He wasn't looking at Gideon. He was looking up at the nearest tree, the old roxbury on the corner of the row, which was loaded so heavy with pink flowers that the branches curved under the weight. "My mom says the orchard used to be everywhere. Like, you'd see apples at every stand in the county." "Your mom's not wrong." Micah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why don't any bees come here?" Gideon stopped working. It was such a simple question. The kind of question that a child asks, because they haven't learned yet that some questions aren't asked in polite company. Questions that, once spoken, rearrange the furniture of a problem you've been living in so long you stopped seeing it clearly. Gideon looked up at the tree, at the blossoms, at the still, quiet air around them. Why don't any bees come here? He'd been so focused on the trees, on the soil chemistry, on the irrigation, on whether he needed to prune differently or spray differently or plant cover crops between the rows. He'd walked these 43 acres in every season for 11 years trying to understand what was wrong with the trees. And he had never once, not once, sat down with the question the boy had just asked him in under 30 seconds. "I don't know," he said. It came out of him flat and honest, the way things do when you're too surprised to dress them up. Micah nodded, like this was a reasonable answer. He looked around at the other trees, squinting a little in the morning sun. "There were bees over at the Lundquist place yesterday when I rode by. Tons of them. But not here." He paused. "There's no hive anywhere on this property, is there?" "There's a wild colony in the woodlot," Gideon said slowly, "about a quarter-mile east. There used to be more, but—" He stopped. He was thinking back, trying to remember when he'd last actually heard bees in the orchard. Last spring? The spring before that? He couldn't pinpoint it, and the fact that he couldn't pinpoint it felt suddenly significant in a way that put ice in his chest. "They need something to pollinate them," Micah said. He said it the way kids that age say things they've read. Matter-of-factly, without ego, just stating what seems obvious to him. "Apples need cross-pollination. Bees are how it happens." "I know that." "I know you know," Micah said, not unkindly. "But knowing something and seeing it are different, right?" Gideon looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at the tree. The blossoms moved slightly in a breeze. Not a single bee. Not one. Just the soft rustle of petals and the smell of sugar going nowhere. The trees are not dying. They are simply alone. So he spent the next 6 days in a state that Bettina would have recognized and called his corkscrew mood. The one where he pulled everything out of the shelves and disappeared into a problem until he'd followed it down to the bottom. He drove to the county extension office and talked to an agronomist named Dale Fitch, who was polite but busy and who confirmed, without much surprise, that colony collapse disorder and habitat loss had decimated wild bee populations across the region over the last 15 years. He went to the library and requested everything they had on pollination dependency and orchard management, which turned out to be 3 books and a shelf of agriculture journals from the 90s. He sat at his kitchen table every evening reading until his eyes gave out. What he learned was this: apple orchards of any size required pollinator density far beyond what wild populations could reliably provide. The old orchards, the ones that had thrived in this county for 100 years, had benefited from a landscape that no longer existed. Fields of clover and wildflower meadows that had once surrounded working farms supporting enormous wild bee populations that drifted naturally from bloom to bloom. Those fields were gone, replaced by corn and soybean monocultures that offered nothing to a bee. The wild colony in his woodlot might number a few thousand insects. A healthy orchard his size needed pollinators numbering in the millions. For 11 years, his trees had been blooming in a landscape that could no longer hear them. He called his brother-in-law Frank, who lived outside of Columbus and had a voice like a drainage pipe, and he explained what he'd found. "So you need bees," Frank said. "I need a lot of bees." "Then get bees." "It's not that simple. Commercial beekeeping is a serious operation. You need equipment, training, a reliable supplier, storage for the honey, and that's if everything goes right. How much?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. He'd done the math 3 times because the first 2 times the number had seemed impossible and he'd needed to check his work. The figure sitting in front of him now was $38,000. That was for 200 hives, enough to provide the pollinator density his orchard needed, along with the equipment, the protective gear, the first year's feed supplements, and a basic honey extraction setup. It did not include his own labor, which would be considerable. His savings account held $41,200. That was all of it. That was the cushion between him and the point where he'd have to start selling parcels of the orchard itself. "Enough," he said. "Is it worth it?" He didn't answer right away. He was looking out the kitchen window at the dark shapes of the trees against the evening sky, old and patient and loaded with blossoms that nobody would ever taste. "I don't know," he said, "but I can't stand not finding out." Well, he told Harvey Boone about it, which was a mistake, but it was the kind of mistake you make when you're excited about something, and the nearest person happens to be someone you've known for 35 years. They ran into each other at the post office. Gideon explained what he'd figured out: the pollinator gap, the collapse of wild bee populations, the hive density requirement. He explained his plan. Harvey listened with his arms crossed, and an expression on his face that suggested he was being very patient. "Gideon," he said when Gideon finished, "you're going to spend $40,000 on bees, on hives, 200 colonies. Yes. For an orchard that hasn't produced a real harvest in 11 years, that's why it hasn't produced." Well, that's what you're telling yourself. Gideon felt something tighten in his jaw. The trees are healthy. The soil is good. I've tested both. The missing element is that those trees are old and played out, Harvey said. You know what the smart move is? Cut them down. Plant something that doesn't require a miracle, or sell the land to someone who'll put it to better use. That land has been in my family for 90 years. I know that. Then you know why I'm not selling it. Harvey shook his head, not unkindly exactly, but with the particular weariness of someone who considers himself practical in a world full of people who aren't. "You'll throw good money after bad," he said. "That's all this is." He walked to his truck. Gideon stood on the sidewalk watching him go and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a man who'd made up his mind. Word got around, the way word does in a town of 1,100. By the end of the week, Gideon had heard variations on Harvey's speech from 4 other people, including his neighbor Dale Kimmel, who stopped him in the hardware store to tell him with genuine concern in his voice that this seemed like a lot of money to spend on a long shot. The feedlot guys at the coffee counter had a different version. They called it the bee scheme, which they said with the casual cruelty of men who thought they were just being honest. The only person who didn't say anything discouraging was Marlowe Reed. He He went into the diner on a Thursday morning for coffee, which he sometimes did when the house felt too quiet. And Marlowe came out from behind the counter and refilled his cup without being asked and sat down across from him in the booth, which she had never done before. She was 45, with dark eyes and the kind of tired that comes from running a small business alone for a decade. Micah was her son. He was from a marriage that had ended when the boy was 4, and she'd moved back to Cedar Hollow because it was where her mother was, and she'd bought the diner because it was what was available, and she made it work the way she made everything work, by not stopping. "He told me about the bees," she said. Micah did. "He asked the right question." She nodded. "He's been asking me about bees every night at dinner for a week. I know more about colony collapse disorder than I ever expected to." Gideon smiled a little. "You and me both. Are you going to do it?" He wrapped both hands around the mug. "I think I have to. I've gone over it enough times. The math is right. The science is right. I can't find the hole in it." "What does your gut say?" He thought about that. "My gut says the trees know what they need. They've been trying to tell me for years, and I wasn't listening." Marlowe looked at him for a moment. She didn't say "that sounds crazy" or "what if you're wrong" or any of the other things that people had been saying for a week. She said, "Well, when the bees get here, bring Micah out to see them. He'll lose his mind." That was all. She went back behind the counter. He drank his coffee. It was, he would think later, exactly the right amount of encouragement. Apang. He found Raina Cross through an agricultural cooperative 3 counties over. She was 48, a third-generation beekeeper who managed somewhere around 800 colonies across several operations and had the kind of relationship with bees that some people have with horses, not controlling them exactly, but working within a mutual understanding that had developed over a very long time. She had short silver hair and wore the same canvas jacket every time Gideon saw her, regardless of weather, and she spoke with the directness of someone who had no interest in making you feel comfortable at the expense of accuracy. She drove out to the Hale property on a Tuesday and walked the orchard with him for 2 hours without saying much. She looked at the trees, which were still in full blossom. She looked at the surrounding landscape, the cornfields to the north and east, the woodlot to the west, the road and the scrubby median strip to the south. She took soil samples from 3 spots without explaining why. She stood in the center of the orchard for about 5 minutes with her hands in her pockets and her face turned up toward the sky, and Gideon stood nearby and did not interrupt whatever she was doing. Then she said, 200 hives is right. You'll want them in clusters of 25 across the property, roughly evenly distributed, placed before the peak of bloom. You've still got maybe 2 weeks of blossom left, which is cutting it close, but the trees will remember." She paused. "I can supply 60 hives immediately. I know a man in Harlan County who can provide the rest within 10 days. "You think this will work?" She looked at him. "I think the trees are perfectly capable of producing. I think you've been trying to solve a problem by looking at the wrong thing for a long time." She wasn't unkind about it, just level. "The question is whether you can manage the bees. It's not complicated, but it requires attention. These aren't machines." "I know that. Do you have any beekeeping experience?" "None." She nodded like this was exactly what she'd expected. "You'll start learning this week then. I'll come out 3 times a week for the first month. After that, you should be able to handle the routine management yourself, and I'll be available by phone." She named a consulting fee that made him wince slightly, but was, he recognized, fair. "One more thing," she said. "Your neighbors are going to have opinions." "They already do. The opinions will get louder once 200 hives show up on this property. Some of that will be legitimate concern. Bee density, flight paths, proximity to adjoining properties. Some of it will be noise from people who don't like change." She held his gaze. "You need to decide now, before the hives arrive, what you're going to let move you and what you're not." Gideon thought about Harvey Boone's face in the post office parking lot. He thought about Bettina, who used to say that the problem with most stubborn people was that they were stubborn about the wrong things. "Bring the bees," he said. The first 60 hives arrived on a flatbed truck on a Friday morning in late April, and it was, without question, the strangest and most astonishing thing Gideon Hale had ever witnessed on this property in 61 years of living on it. Raina Cross rode up front with the driver. Gideon was already there when they arrived, having been awake since 4 in the morning, though he would not have admitted this to anyone. He'd made coffee and stood on the porch looking at the dark orchard and feeling something in his chest that he couldn't name precisely. Not quite fear, not quite excitement, something in between that was probably closer to the feeling you get when you've made an irreversible decision and you're waiting to find out if you were right. The hives came off the truck in wooden boxes, white painted and deliberately orderly, stacked too high on pallets. They were sealed for transport, the bees inside a low, humming vibration that Gideon felt before he heard it, a sound at the edge of perception, like a machine running somewhere underground. Raina handed him a full veil, a pair of elbow-length gloves, and a jacket with sealed cuffs without ceremony. "Put these on," she said, "and listen. The bees are already stressed from transport. Keep your movements slow and don't swat. If one lands on you and you leave it alone, it will leave you alone. If you panic, they'll feel it. They're remarkably good at feeling it." "They're insects," Gideon said. "They're a superorganism," Raina said, in the tone of someone correcting a category error. "Each hive is one entity with 100,000 moving parts, respected accordingly." He put on the equipment. He felt ridiculous. He did it anyway. They placed the first cluster of hives near the old Roxbury trees on the east end, 8 pallets in a shallow arc, the entrances facing south-southeast the way Raina had mapped out the previous week. When Raina broke the first seal and the bees began emerging, slowly at first, then in a stream, then in what seemed like an impossible number, a living vapor rising from the boxes and spreading through the air, Gideon stood completely still and felt something he hadn't expected. He felt the silence break, not violently, not dramatically, just a sound returning to a place that had been quiet too long. A hum threading through the rows of trees, filling the spaces between the blossoms, moving through the morning air like something that belonged there. The bees didn't know what they were doing in any conscious sense, and yet they knew exactly what they were doing, moving from flower to flower with the precision of a system that had been working for 100 million years, every motion purposeful, every visit leaving something behind. Gideon stood in the middle of the east row of Roxbury trees, surrounded by more insects than he could count, and he felt the prickling behind his eyes that he absolutely was not going to let go any further. Raina appeared beside him. She was not looking at him. She was watching the bees work the blossoms with the focused attention of someone reading a document in a foreign language. "They're orienting," she said. "Give them 4 hours. By afternoon, they'll have mapped the property." "They can do that in 4 hours?" "They don't map it the way you're thinking. They share information. When a forager finds a good food source, she goes back to the hive and tells the others where to go." She paused. "They vote on it, actually. Other bees evaluate the information, and the ones that agree do a matching dance. Eventually, the hive reaches consensus. They vote. Welcome to beekeeping." Ite. Micah came out that afternoon, after school. He stood at the edge of the orchard in his oversized boots with his eyes about as wide as eyes can go, and didn't say anything for almost a full minute, which, based on what Gideon had observed of him, was probably a personal record. "There's so many," Micah finally said. "About 600,000 at the moment," Gideon said. "When the rest arrive, closer to 20 million. Micah turned to look at him with an expression Gideon recognized. The expression of a person revising their understanding of what was possible. 20 million bees, Micah said. "Give or take." The boy looked back at the trees. The hum was audible from where they stood, a constant undercurrent of industry that made the air feel different, denser, more alive. The blossoms were moving, not from wind, from the bees working through them. "They're doing it," Micah said quietly. "They're actually doing it." "They are." "Does it feel like—" He stopped, searching for the right word. "Does it feel like you were right?" Gideon considered this. He watched a single bee travel along the nearest branch, moving from blossom to blossom with tireless efficiency, carrying something invisible between flowers that would, over the coming weeks, become fruit. "Feels like I'm watching something that was always supposed to happen," he said, "like it was just waiting." Micah nodded slowly. He had the serious look that certain kids get when they're storing something up for later. They stood together at the edge of the orchard while the bees worked the blossoms in the long April light, and neither of them said anything more for a while. And the silence that had lived in this place for 11 years was, for the first time in 11 years, completely gone. The remaining 140 hives arrived over the following 10 days, staggered deliveries that Gideon and Raina placed with careful attention to spacing and flight path and the prevailing wind direction in each section of the orchard. By the second week of May, all 200 colonies were established on the property, and the Hale Orchard had become a different kind of place. The sound was the first thing you noticed. You could hear it from the road now. Not a threatening sound, nothing like a swarm, just a constant, layered hum that rose and fell with the temperature of the day. Gideon had started to distinguish different registers in it, though he could not have explained this to anyone. The morning hum was higher pitched and more purposeful. The late afternoon hum had a settling quality to it, like a room where a meeting has just ended. The second thing you noticed, if you walked the rows, was the motion. The trees were alive in a new way. Every blossom with a bee on it, and bees on most blossoms, and the branches moving slightly, not from wind, but from the constant landing and departing of 100,000 foragers working their routes through the morning. And slowly, over 2 weeks, then 3, the petals began to fall away and leave behind something small and hard and green. Fruit, not in every spot, not uniformly, but enough. More than enough. More than Gideon had seen in 11 years. He walked the East Row on a Sunday morning in late May and stopped in front of the old Roxbury and put his hand on a branch and counted. There were 14 small apples on one branch. He counted again. 14. He moved to the next branch. 11. He stood there in the morning quiet. Not the old silence, nothing like the old silence. The air was buzzing softly all around him. And he thought about his grandfather carrying rock from the creek bed, and his father expanding the lines, and Bettina in her green jacket walking with him in the fall. And he thought about 11 years of watching blossoms fall into nothing, and he stood very still for a moment and held onto the branch. Then he let go and kept walking, because there was still work to do. In Cedar Hollow, the opinions continued. Harvey Boone had told someone at the grain elevator that Gideon was going to get himself in regulatory trouble with that many hives. Dale Kimmel had mentioned to 2 people that he was allergic to bee stings, and the property line was only 300 yards from his south pasture. There was a general quality to the conversation in town that suggested people were waiting to see what would go wrong. But Marlowe Reed put a handwritten sign in the diner window that said, "Ask me about the Hale Orchard honey, coming this fall." She hadn't told Gideon she was going to do that. She just did it, the way she did most things, without announcement, without asking permission. He found out when he came in for coffee on a Wednesday and saw it. "You're getting ahead of things," he said. "I'm generating anticipation," she said. "There's a difference. More coffee?" He pushed his mug toward her. "It's going to be a while before there's any honey. I know that, but people need something to look forward to." She poured without spilling a drop. "And you need people to be on your side before you need them to be. That's not something you can ask for last minute." He looked at her. She was already turning back to the counter, already moving to the next thing. "Thank you," he said. "Drink your coffee," she said, "before it gets cold." Outside the diner windows, Cedar Hollow went about its morning, and 2 miles up the hill, in the rows of apple trees that a community had written off and a family had not, 20 million bees were doing the work that would, quietly, steadily, against all expectation, change everything. By the middle of June, Gideon Hale had been stung 47 times. He kept count. The way he kept count of most things, not obsessively, just carefully, the way a man who has spent his life farming learns to track what the land is doing to him. The first sting had been on the inside of his left wrist, on his 3rd day working with Raina, when he'd moved too quickly, reaching into a hive, and a guard bee had done exactly what guard bees are designed to do. He'd made a sound, not quite a word, not quite not a word, and Raina had looked over from 3 frames away and said, "Don't rub it, that releases more venom. Scrape the stinger sideways with your fingernail." He'd scraped it sideways with his fingernail. His wrist had swollen to the size of a small apple and stayed that way for 2 days. By sting number 12, he'd stopped flinching. By sting number 30, he barely noticed unless the location was inconvenient. The back of the neck was bad. The thin skin behind the knee was worse. Sting 47 had been on his right earlobe, which had made Raina press her lips together in the way she did when she was not going to laugh. "Your body's building tolerance," she'd told him on one of her Tuesday visits in early June. They were working the hives in the northwest corner of the orchard, the ones placed along the old stone wall his grandfather had built. A lot of beekeepers barely react after the first season. "How long does that take?" "Depends on the person. You're already better than most beginners." He didn't point out that he was 61 years old and that the swelling around sting number 33 had lasted 4 days and involved colors he hadn't expected. He just nodded and kept working. That was the thing about learning beekeeping at his age that nobody told you, probably because nobody who could tell you assumed you'd be doing it. It was humbling in a very specific way. Not the humbling of failure, which Gideon had experienced plenty and could absorb. This was the humbling of competence, of being genuinely, obviously, undeniably bad at something that required patience and attention and muscle memory he hadn't built yet, and having to keep doing it anyway, every day, in front of someone who was very good at it. Raina was a patient teacher, but she was not a soft one. She didn't correct him gently or cushion her observations. If he was moving too fast, she said he was moving too fast. If he was reading a frame wrong, she took it from him and showed him what he'd missed without a lot of preamble. She expected him to remember things he was told once, and when he forgot, which happened more often than he would have liked, she told him again with the same directness and without any visible frustration, which was somehow worse than if she'd been frustrated. "You're overthinking the smoke," she said one morning, watching him work the bellows on the smoker with more concentration than the task warranted. "It's not chemistry, you're just slowing them down." "How much is enough?" "Enough. Not so much you're choking them, you'll feel when it's right." "I've been farming for 40 years and you're telling me to feel it. Farming and beekeeping aren't the same thing." She reached over and took the smoker from him and gave 2 casual puffs at the hive entrance, the motion as natural as breathing. "You're used to managing things, soil, water, weather, things you can measure. Bees don't work that way. You manage the relationship. The rest is theirs." He thought about that for a while. She handed the smoker back. "What if I can't learn that?" he said. "You already are learning it," she said. "You just can't tell yet because you're still in the part where you don't know what you don't know." She looked at him steadily. That part ends. He kept working. The hum of the nearby hives surrounded them, layered and constant, and somewhere in the trees above, bees were doing what bees do. Moving from flower to flower, carrying what needed to be carried, making something out of what was available. The orchard required more of him than he'd budgeted for, and not just financially. By June, his day started at 5:30 and rarely ended before 8, and the work was not the familiar work of a man managing land he'd known for decades. It was new work, learning to read behavior he'd never had to read before, watching for signs of disease and stress and swarming instinct, keeping records of which hives were thriving and which were lagging and what the difference was. Raina had given him a worn spiral notebook and told him to write down everything, every visit to every hive cluster, every observation, every question, because he would need to refer back to it and because the act of writing forced him to pay the kind of attention that produced something worth writing. He filled the first notebook in 3 weeks. He bought another. The apple trees were doing something they hadn't done in 11 years. They were setting fruit in earnest. The small, hard green knobs he'd counted in May had grown through June into actual apples, small but real, weighing down branches that had carried only air for a long time. Not every tree was producing equally. The younger Honeycrisps along the south slope were outpacing the older varieties, which was predictable, and one section of Cortland's near the western fence was lagging in ways he was watching carefully. But the overall volume was something he hadn't let himself calculate yet, because calculating it felt like the kind of thing that invited catastrophe. He said as much to Marlowe on a Thursday morning, sitting in the booth by the window while the diner hummed with the breakfast crowd. "That's superstition talking," she said, setting a plate of eggs in front of him that he hadn't ordered but had clearly needed. "You grew up farming. You know that counting what you have doesn't make you lose it. Counting what you don't have yet does. Then count what you do have." She sat down across from him for 3 minutes, which was as long as she ever sat down during the breakfast rush. "The trees are producing. That's not a projection. That's a fact you can see with your eyes. It could still fail. So could anything." She looked at him with the expression she probably gave Micah when he was circling something instead of saying it. "You made a decision, and you followed through on it, and it's working. That's allowed to feel like something, Gideon." He looked out the window at Main Street, at the hardware store across the road, and the 2 old men on the bench in front of it who had been on that bench, in Gideon's memory, for approximately his entire life. "Harvey Boone told the Kimmels I was going to bankrupt myself," he said. "Harvey Boone tells everyone everything about everyone." She stood up, smoothing her apron. He said something similar about me when I bought the diner. He told Ray Bledsoe I'd be out of business in 18 months. She picked up the coffee pot she'd set on the edge of the table. That was 9 years ago. She went back to work. Gideon ate the eggs, which were better than anything he made for himself, and watched Main Street go about its morning. The conversation in Cedar Hollow had settled into a particular register that he recognized from having lived in small communities his whole life. It wasn't hostility, exactly. It was a kind of suspended judgment. People waiting to see what would happen with just enough skepticism to protect themselves from having been wrong if it failed, and just enough curiosity to want to watch. He heard things secondhand, the way you always do in a town this size, that the smell from the orchard was carrying farther than expected on certain winds, that someone's cousin had driven past and said the hives were stacked practically on top of each other, that the county was eventually going to have something to say about all of it. That last one was coming. Gideon wasn't naive about it. He'd read the county ordinances on commercial bee operations when he was putting the plan together, and he'd determined that he was within the letter of the regulations as they were written. But regulations and enforcement were two different things, and what triggered enforcement in a small county often had less to do with the rules than with who decided to make a call. He put that thought away. There was too much work in front of him to spend energy on hypotheticals. The education continued, and not all of it came from Raina. On a Saturday morning in mid-June, Micah showed up at the orchard on his bike, which he had apparently started doing on a semi-regular basis, though Gideon had not formally invited this and was not sure exactly when it had become part of the weekly pattern. He arrived with a library book under one arm and an expression of focused purpose that Gideon associated with the boy having done significant research since their last conversation. Did you know, Micah said before he'd even dropped the kickstand, that a queen bee mates once in her entire life? Like one flight, that's it. And she stores enough from that to fertilize eggs for the next 3 to 5 years. I did know that, Gideon said. Raina told me. Micah looked briefly deflated that he hadn't surprised him, then rallied. But did you know that if the queen dies, the workers can create a new queen from a regular egg? They feed it royal jelly instead of regular food, and that changes everything about what it becomes. I also know that one. Okay. Micah parked his bike against the fence and came over to where Gideon was working on a hive cluster near the old stone wall. What don't you know? Gideon straightened up and thought about it honestly. How to tell the difference between a hive that's building towards swarming and one that's just crowded? Micah's eyes lit up, which was the specific expression of a 12-year-old who had, in fact, read something about this. I'll look it up, he said. Don't do me any favors. Too late. He opened his library book and started flipping. Gideon went back to work, suppressing something that was not quite a smile. What Micah brought over those June weeks was something that Raina's expertise couldn't provide, which was enthusiasm uncomplicated by the knowledge of how things could go wrong. When Gideon walked the East Row and felt the anxiety of a man who had spent nearly everything he had on an unproven idea, the boy walked it and saw proof that something impossible was happening. He had opinions about which hive clusters seemed most active. He asked questions that were sometimes naive and occasionally so pointed they made Gideon stop and think. He'd started keeping his own notebook, a beat-up composition book with a drawing of a bee on the cover that he'd done himself in pencil, and he filled it with observations that were partly scientific and partly something else. The observations of a person paying close attention to something they found genuinely remarkable. They recognize each other, Micah said one afternoon, watching a forager bee return to a hive entrance and interact with the guard bees. Like, the guards can tell who belongs and who doesn't by smell. Every hive has a different smell. That's right. So if you moved a bee from one hive to another, the guards would know. They'd reject it, probably kill it. Micah absorbed this. That seems harsh. That's colony survival. The hive can't afford to let the wrong thing in. Gideon paused, watching the entrance activity. Works for people too sometimes. The difference is people get to decide what the criteria are. Bees don't have that problem. The boy looked at him with the particular expression of someone filing something away. Then he looked back at the hive. Do you think the trees know the bees are here? He asked. Like, not no, but do they respond somehow? Gideon looked up at the nearest tree. A branch 6 feet overhead was loaded with developing apples, dozens of them, more than he'd seen on a single branch in a decade. I think the trees have been waiting, he said. Whether that's knowing or not, I can't say. Bob. Harvey Boone came to the orchard in the last week of June. He didn't call ahead. He just showed up on a Tuesday morning, his truck pulling up the gravel lane that led to the equipment shed, and he climbed out with his hands in his pockets and looked at the rows of trees the way he looked at everything, with his chin slightly raised, measuring. Gideon was in the middle of checking a hive cluster in the south section. He saw the truck and felt a familiar tightening in his jaw. But he finished what he was doing before he walked over, because leaving work half done because someone showed up uninvited was not something he was willing to do. Harvey was standing near the edge of the first row when Gideon reached him. He was looking up at the trees, specifically at the loaded branches, the developing apples clustered thickly enough in places that you'd have to count them to believe the number. "Well," Harvey said. Gideon waited. "That's more fruit than I've seen on this property in a while." Harvey said it the way a man says something he'd rather not say, without inflection, just getting it out. "Yes." Harvey turned to look at the nearest hive cluster. 25 white boxes in their arc near the stone wall, bees moving in and out of the entrances in that constant, purposeful stream. He watched for a moment. "How many hives did you end up with?" 200. Harvey nodded slowly. "That's a lot of bees on a residential road." "The setbacks are within county code. I checked the ordinances before I ordered the first hive." Harvey nodded again. He didn't push back on that, which meant he'd probably checked too. He looked back at the trees. "I'm not saying it hasn't worked," he said, after a pause that felt calibrated. "I can see it's working. I'm saying you took a hell of a risk." "I know I did." "That bothers you that I said that." "It would bother you too," Gideon said. "If you put everything you had left into something and it was working, and the first thing someone said was you took a risk." Harvey looked at him. Something shifted in his expression. Not an apology, Harvey Boone did not traffic in those, but something in the vicinity. "You're right," he said, which surprised Gideon enough that he almost didn't catch it. "You're probably right." He put his hands back in his pockets and looked at the rows of heavy, fruit-laden trees. "What are you going to do with the honey? Sell it? Local first? Marlowe's already talking about stocking it at the diner. Regional, eventually, if the quality is there." "Raina Cross helping you with extraction?" "She set up the equipment. I'll manage the harvest." Harvey nodded. He looked like he was calculating something. "You're going to have a good harvest this fall," he said. It was not quite a concession and not quite a compliment, just a statement of observed fact from a man who had been farming long enough to recognize what he was looking at. "That's the plan," Gideon said. Harvey walked back to his truck without saying anything else, and Gideon watched him go and thought, "That's as close to wrong as Harvey Boone will ever admit to being." And then he went back to work. July arrived and the orchard kept doing what the orchard was doing, which was producing with a consistency and volume that Gideon had started writing down every evening in the second notebook. Not because he'd stopped being superstitious, but because the numbers were becoming too significant to hold in his head. The Honeycrisps were running 30 to 40% ahead of his best projections. The old Roxbury trees, which he'd worried about most, were producing in a way that felt almost personal, like they'd been storing something up for a decade and had finally found the occasion to spend it. He'd started talking to Raina about the honey harvest timeline. The hives were healthy and heavy. The bees had been working the orchard's flowers, as well as the surrounding meadow strips he'd planted between the rows. Clover, borage, phacelia, and the supers he'd added on Raina's instruction were filling faster than either of them had projected. "You're going to have more honey than you expected," Raina told him on a July Thursday, pulling a frame from one of the fuller hives near the east wall. The frame was capped across nearly its entire surface, a pattern of flat golden wax over cells packed with finished honey. She held it up to the light. "This is a good first year." "Is it?" He'd been telling himself not to say that, but it came out anyway. She looked at him over the frame. "You're going to ask me that question every time I give you good news, aren't you?" "Probably." "Yes," she said. "It's a good first year, better than most beekeepers see in 3. She put the frame back carefully. "The orchard is the reason. The diversity of bloom you've got running through summer is unusual for this region. Most of what's around here is monoculture. Your bees are eating exceptionally well. He thought about his grandfather planting the Roxbury trees in 1931, and his father adding the Cortlands in the 50s, and the odd strips of wildflower his grandmother had kept along the fence lines because she liked the look of them. None of them had known they were building a pollinator habitat. They'd just been building something they thought was worth building. "Raina," he said. "What? Do you think I should plant more wildflower strips along the north fence line? There's a section I've been leaving as ground cover that I could convert." She closed the hive and looked at the north fence line, which was maybe 200 yards away. "Yes," she said. "Do it in early spring. Mix of phacelia and Dutch clover and some native wildflower. I'll send you a list." She paused. "You're thinking ahead." "Trying to. That's a beekeeper thinking." She picked up her tool case. "Now come look at the hives on the west end. I want you to see something that's going to make you nervous." He followed her. Whatever she wanted to show him, he'd look at it and learn what he needed to learn from it. That was all there was to it. On the last Sunday in July, Marlowe organized what she called a soft announcement, her words, at the diner. She'd made a small poster for the window, updated from the hand-lettered one she'd put up in May, this one with a drawing Micah had done of a bee carrying what appeared to be a disproportionately large apple. Several people came in during the morning who hadn't been in specifically to talk about the orchard, and Marlowe mentioned it naturally in conversation the way she mentioned everything, without pushing, just placing it there for people to pick up if they wanted it. Gideon had agreed to stop in at noon. He sat at the counter and answered questions from whoever came up, and several people did. Farmers he knew, a few families from town, the librarian who'd helped him pull the agriculture journals back in April, and seemed personally invested in the outcome. They asked about the bees, about the honey, about how many apples he expected in the fall. He answered honestly, including the honest parts that involved uncertainty. Dale Kimmel came in at 12:30, which Gideon had not expected. He sat 2 stools down and ordered coffee, and didn't immediately say anything, which was its own kind of message. After a few minutes, Dale said, "I'll admit the trees look different than they did in spring." "They are different," Gideon said. "I haven't been out that way in a couple weeks, but I drove past Monday, and you can see the fruit from the road now." "There's fruit to see." Dale stirred his coffee. He was 62, a decent man, the kind of person who worried about things genuinely rather than performatively. "I'm not against you, Gideon. I want to be clear about that. I've got the allergy concern, which is real. I know it's real. But I'm not trying to make trouble. I know that too." Gideon meant it. Dale Kimmel was not Harvey Boone. He was a man with a legitimate concern and the social awkwardness of not knowing how to say, "I was worried and I see it differently now." "If you ever have a reaction anywhere near the property, you come tell me directly. I'll be transparent about whatever the county requires." Dale nodded, both hands around his coffee mug. "Fair enough. It wasn't a friendship renewed, but it was something." In Cedar Hollow, that was how opinions moved. Not in speeches, not in announcements, but in small concessions at diner counters, on porches, in parking lots, 2 people deciding at a time that maybe the thing they'd been skeptical about was worth a second look. Gideon stayed at the diner until 2 o'clock. He ate lunch. He talked to people he'd known for decades about something he'd built in 6 months, and he answered their questions without defensiveness. And when he drove back up the hill to the orchard in the late afternoon, the hum was there waiting for him. Constant and purposeful and utterly indifferent to what anyone in town had thought or said or decided. The bees were not interested in public opinion. They had work to do. He went and helped them do it. August in Cedar Hollow arrived the way August always did in that part of the country, without apology. The heat settled over the valley like something with weight to it, pressing down on the corn and the soybean fields and the gravel roads and the tin roofs of the equipment sheds, and by 7 in the morning, the air already had that close, thick quality that made men reach for water before they'd done anything to deserve being thirsty. In the orchard, the heat meant something different. The apples had been sizing up through July, and now they were serious about it. The Honeycrisps running deep red and gold on the south-facing branches, the Cortlands darkening from green to that particular shade of burgundy that Gideon's father used to call harvest color. And the old Roxbury trees, the ones his grandfather had planted in 1931, carrying fruit in quantities that Gideon had genuinely never seen in his lifetime on this property. Not in the good years his parents had talked about, not in the photographs from the 50s that still sat in a shoebox in his bedroom closet. The Roxbury apples were smaller than the commercial varieties, russeted and uneven and not particularly pretty to look at, but when you bit into one, there was a complexity to the flavor that the prettier apples couldn't match, sharp and sweet, and something almost nutty underneath. The taste of a variety that had been bred before anyone started optimizing for shelf life and appearance. He'd given one to Raina in the second week of August, pulling it off the tree and handing it to her without comment. She'd bitten into it, chewed, and looked at the tree with an expression that was as close to reverence as Raina Cross got. "You should charge more for these than the Honey Crisps," she said. "You think? People who know what they're tasting will pay for something they can't get anywhere else. These aren't in any grocery store I've ever been in." She took another bite. "These are what apples used to taste like." He'd thought about that on the walk back to the equipment shed, and he'd thought about it again that evening, writing in the second notebook. What apples used to taste like. There was something in that worth turning over. The idea that the thing which looked worst, the old misshapen trees that Harvey Boone would have cut for timber without losing a night's sleep, might be carrying the most value. That sometimes what everyone agreed to leave behind was left behind for the wrong reasons. But he didn't write that down. He wrote down the yield projections and the hive inspection notes and the observation that the Northwest cluster needed a super added before the end of the week. There was poetry somewhere in what the orchard was doing, and there was time for it later. Right now, there was work. The storm came on a Wednesday night in the third week of August, and it announced itself badly. Weather in that part of the state could move fast when it wanted to. Systems that showed up on radar as a vague smudge in the west and arrived 3 hours later as something that took the tops off trees. The forecast that day had mentioned the possibility of evening thunderstorms, which in August was about as specific as predicting that it would be hot. Gideon had listened to it on the radio while eating lunch and noted it with the half attention of a man who has tracked weather most of his life and developed a calibrated sense of when to worry. He started worrying around 4 in the afternoon. The sky to the northwest had gone the wrong color. Not the dark blue-gray of regular storm clouds, but a greenish yellow that meant rotation somewhere up in the system, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in 40 minutes, and the wind had stopped completely. In Gideon's experience, a wind that stopped when it should have been picking up meant the air was doing something more organized than a regular storm. He called Raina. "How bad do you think it is?" he said. "I don't know yet. I'm watching it." She was at her own operation 20 miles northeast, which meant she'd see it before him if it moved the direction he was worried about. "What's the sky doing?" "Green to the northwest. Wind's gone dead." A pause. "Okay, start securing the west hives now. Any cluster that's elevated or exposed. Strap the supers down if you can do it fast. The mature hives can handle wind better than you'd think, but you don't want anything toppling." He was already moving toward the equipment shed before she finished talking. "What about the fruit?" "If it's hail, you'll lose some. Can't prevent that. Focus on the hives." He grabbed the ratchet straps from the hook inside the shed door and went to work. He started with the west cluster, which was the most exposed section of the property, the one along the ridge above the stone wall where the wind would hit first and hardest. 25 hives, stacked with honey supers on most of them, the supers full enough now that each additional box added significant weight and wind resistance. He worked as fast as his hip allowed, which was not as fast as he needed. He got straps around 12 hives before the wind came back. When it came back wrong. Not a building gust, but a sustained push from a direction that didn't match the direction the clouds were moving, which meant the storm was rotating nearby and the surface wind was being pulled toward it. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees in the time it took him to move from the 12th hive to the 13th. Above him, the sky had gone the color of old iron. He got to 18 hives before the first lightning hit close enough that the thunder was simultaneous with the flash. And even a stubborn man recognizes the moment when what you're doing is no longer farming and has crossed the line into something else. He grabbed the straps and the tool bag and ran. Not gracefully, not without pain in his left hip, but he ran, back to the equipment shed, and pulled the door shut behind him just as the rain started. What came after the rain was not hail, which was the one mercy. It was wind and rain and lightning that went on for an hour and 40 minutes, and Gideon sat in the equipment shed on an overturned bucket and listened to it hit the metal roof and told himself that the hives could take it, and tried to believe that. When it stopped, the quiet was the kind that follows violence, sudden and fragile, the world recalibrating. He went out before it was fully dark. He had a flashlight and the portable radio and the tight, contained feeling of a man who is walking toward news he's not sure he wants. 6 hives had toppled in the west cluster. Of those, 4 had broken apart when they fell, the wooden boxes splitting on the rocky ground below the ridgeline. The frames inside scattered and exposed, thousands of bees displaced and agitated and confused in the wet dark. One of the supers had rolled 15 feet down the slope. One hive had landed against the stone wall with enough force to crack 2 of the boxes, but somehow stayed mostly intact. The trees had held. That was the thing he kept telling himself as he walked the rows with the flashlight, checking branches for wind damage. The trees had held. He lost some fruit to the wind. He could see it on the ground. Apples knocked loose before they were ready, dozens of them in the west rows, maybe more. But the branches had not broken. The old trees bent and did not break, which was what old trees did when they'd had enough seasons to learn how. He went back to the 6 toppled hives and worked in the rain-wet dark for 2 hours, doing what he could alone with gloves and a veil and the flashlight propped against a fence post. He couldn't fully reassemble the broken boxes in the dark, but he could consolidate the frames, stack what was stackable, cover the exposed sections with the emergency tarps from the shed. He could keep the queens safe for the night, or try to. Raina called at 10 o'clock. "How bad?" she said. 6 hives down on the west cluster, 4 broken apart. The rest are okay as far as I can tell in the dark. A pause. "Queen losses?" "I don't know yet. I can't fully assess until morning." "Okay." She was quiet for a moment. "You did the straps?" "Got 18 of 25 before the lightning ran me in." "The 18 that are strapped?" "All standing." "Good. That's good." He could hear her making notes or doing something with paper. "I'll be there at 6 tomorrow. Don't try to do more tonight. You'll miss things in the dark and you could hurt yourself." "I know that." "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." He stood in the orchard for a few minutes after she hung up, the flashlight off, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. The sky had cleared the way skies do after violent weather, aggressively as if making a point, and there were stars now, and the moon was coming up behind the east tree line. Around him, the hives that were standing hummed their constant hum, quieter than in the heat of the day, but continuous, uninterrupted. The colony going on doing what the colony does regardless of what the weather had done. He was 61 years old, and he had sunk $38,000 into this operation, and the harvest was 6 weeks away, and he was standing in a wet orchard in the dark counting 6 broken hive boxes and thinking about how much he did not want to lose this. He let himself think it. He didn't try to push it aside or talk himself into optimism. He just let the thought be what it was. The fear of a man who had bet on himself and still wasn't sure he'd been right to. Then he went inside, changed his wet clothes, and set his alarm for 5:15. Raina arrived at 6 with a truck full of replacement equipment and a young man from her operation named Curtis, who said approximately 9 words over the course of the morning, but worked with an efficiency that covered for the lack of conversation. They assessed the 6 downed hives, and the news was what it was. 2 queens confirmed dead, 4 hives that could be rehabilitated with new equipment and careful management, 2 that would need to be merged with stronger colonies. Honey loss from the broken supers was not catastrophic. The capped cells had survived better than the uncapped, and Raina recovered more than he'd expected. "You'll lose some production from these 6, she said, while Curtis reassembled frames with the methodical focus of someone who had done it many hundreds of times. "Not the whole harvest. You'll need to order 2 new queens. I can get them within the week." She paused. "The orchard itself?" "Fruit loss on the west rows. I counted this morning. I'm down maybe 6 to 8% on the west honey crisps. The Roxbury trees held." She nodded. 6 to 8% is a bad night. It's not a bad harvest. He knew that. Knowing it and feeling it were, as Micah had once observed, different things. Marlowe drove up at 9 with a thermos of coffee and 3 sandwiches, which she set on the tailgate of Gideon's truck without announcement and went to help Curtis carry equipment without asking if she was needed. She was wearing her off-day clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt with a small paint stain on the sleeve from some home project or another, and she worked with the practical competence of someone who had spent years doing what needed to be done without standing around waiting to be told. Gideon came to the tailgate for coffee, and she poured him a cup without ceremony. "You look like you slept 4 hours," she said. 5.5. Liar. He drank the coffee. It was better than his, which it always was. "The harvest is still there," he said. "Damaged, but not destroyed." "I know. Micah rode his bike up here at 7 this morning to look. He texted me a full report before I even left the house." She said this with the particular mix of exasperation and pride that parents of certain children carry around. "He counted the downed hives and the lost fruit on the west rows and gave me an estimate." "Was he close?" "He said 7% fruit loss on the west side. You said 6 to 8. Gideon looked at her. "He's 12. He's been paying attention." She poured her own coffee. "He's planning to come back after school. I told him to ask you first." "He doesn't need to ask." She nodded. They stood at the tailgate for a moment, drinking coffee in the post-storm morning, which had the particular clarity that bad weather leaves behind. The air scrubbed clean, the light sharper than usual, everything slightly too bright and too defined. "You're going to be okay," she said. Not reassurance exactly, more like a statement of observed fact from someone who had been watching him closely enough to have an informed opinion. "Yeah," he said. He meant it, mostly. Done. The letter arrived 4 days after the storm. It came in a standard county envelope, the kind with the seal in the upper left corner, and it sat on his kitchen table for 20 minutes while he stood at the counter drinking his morning coffee and looking at it the way you look at something you've been half expecting without wanting to admit it. He opened it. It was formal language arranged in the way formal language always is, structured to be comprehensive and to leave the recipient with no clean foothold for complaint. The summary of it, stripped of the bureaucratic scaffolding, was this. A formal complaint had been filed with the County Agricultural Office alleging that the beekeeping operation at 4417 Orchard Hill Road was in violation of Cedar Hollow Township Code, Section 14, subsection C, which governed the placement of commercial apiaries within 300 feet of adjoining property lines. The complaint alleged that 7 of the hive clusters on the Hale property were positioned within the restricted distance. It requested a formal inspection and gave him 30 days to demonstrate compliance or begin removal of the non-compliant hives. Gideon set the letter on the table and sat down. He had read Section 14, subsection C. He had read it in March before the first hive arrived. He had measured the setback distances himself with a measuring wheel, walking the property line with Raina on a cold April afternoon, and they had placed every cluster with those measurements in mind. He was certain, or had been certain, that every hive was compliant. He got up and went to the filing cabinet in the back room where he kept the farm records, and he found the property survey document he'd had done in 2018, and he spread it on the kitchen table and placed the county letter beside it, and looked at both for a long time. The property survey showed the official boundary lines, the setback from the southwest corner of the property to the nearest hive cluster, the one in the south section along the fence line, was 284 feet. He had measured it at 312. The difference was 28 feet. The difference was the question of where exactly the property line was. He called Raina. She listened to him read the key section of the letter, then was quiet for a moment. "Is this from the county directly, or is it a response to a filed complaint?" "Filed complaint." "From who?" He looked at the bottom of the letter. There was a case reference number and a complaint filing date and the name of the county officer who had assigned the inspection. There was no name attached to the complaint itself. "It doesn't say." "It doesn't have to say," Raina said, and her voice had gone flat in a way it didn't usually go. "Complaints like this are filed anonymously, technically. But in a county this size, if someone filed this 4 days after a storm that everyone knows hit your property—" "I know," Gideon said. "Do you know the survey on your southwest line?" "I had it done in 2018. I've got it in front of me." "And the setback from that line to the south cluster?" He measured it on the survey with his thumb, estimating. "My survey says the line is here. If the county is using a different baseline, then the 28 feet could go either way," Raina said. "That's the problem. If there's any ambiguity in the official boundary, the county will default to what the complaint says." A pause. "You need to get a current survey done, official, done by a licensed surveyor." "How fast can that happen?" Weeks, maybe a month. The inspection is in 30 days. He sat back in the chair. Through the kitchen window he could see the orchard, or the edge of it. The first row of Honeycrisps along the south slope, loaded with fruit that was 10 days from harvest if the weather held. 10 days. The hives that the letter was asking him to remove or relocate were the south cluster and 6 others, 140 hives total, because whoever had filed this complaint had not gone small. 140 hives removed from the orchard 10 days before peak harvest would not destroy the crop. But it would damage it in ways he couldn't fully calculate yet, and the damage would come at the worst possible moment. He thought about Harvey Boone standing in the orchard in June looking at the fruit on the trees with his chin raised and his hands in his pockets. He thought about Harvey's voice in the feed store parking lot. Cut your losses. He thought about being very specific about what he was angry about before he let himself be angry about it. Because anger aimed at the wrong thing was just destruction looking for a reason. "Raina," he said, "can any of the 7 clusters actually be moved? Legally, I mean. Is there a compliant location on this property I could relocate to?" She thought. He could almost hear her laying out the property in her memory, the way she'd done when they'd placed the hives in April. Maybe 4 of the 7. The south cluster, those would have to come off the property or go to storage. You can't get them to a compliant position within the current boundaries if the county is using their baseline. How many hives is that? The south cluster is 25. 25 hives removed from the south section in the 2 weeks before harvest. Yes. He looked at the survey and the letter and the window and the orchard. He thought about $38,000 and his grandfather's stone wall and 11 years of silence and a 12-year-old boy asking the right question. "All right," he said. "Get me the name of the best surveyor in the county. I'll text you in 10 minutes. And Raina? Yeah. If someone came to you with this kind of complaint about your operation, someone who filed it 4 days after a storm, anonymously, right before your harvest, what would you do?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'd figure out exactly what the rules say, every word, and I'd make sure I was bulletproof on every single point before I walked into that inspection. And if I'm not bulletproof, then you move the hives you have to move, and you document every inch of what you do, and you don't give them anything else to grab onto." Her voice was steady. "You're not done, Gideon. This isn't the thing that ends it." He stayed at the kitchen table for a while after he hung up. The orchard was out there in the late August morning doing what it had been doing all summer, producing, steadily tree by tree, the bees moving through it in their constant, purposeful thousands. In 6 weeks, none of this would matter. Either the harvest would come and it would justify everything, or it wouldn't. But 6 weeks was a long way from now. He went to the back room and got the file on the county regulations and brought it to the kitchen table and started reading Section 14 again from the beginning, because whoever had filed that complaint was counting on him not knowing it well enough to fight back. And if there was one thing that 61 years of farming had taught him, it was that you never walked into a fight with the field you wanted. You fought on the field you had, with what you knew and what you could prove. He read until noon. He took notes in the margin. He found 3 things that the complaint had not accounted for or had assumed he wouldn't catch. That afternoon he called Marlo. "I need to ask you something," he said when she answered. "Ask." "Not on the phone. Can you come out to the orchard this evening, after the diner closes?" A brief pause. "Micah has a thing at school at 7, but I can be there by 8:30. "That works." "Gideon." Her voice changed slightly. "Is this serious?" He looked at the letter on the kitchen table. "Someone filed a complaint with the county, trying to get me to remove most of my hives before harvest." The silence on her end had a particular quality to it, the quality of a person deciding how to respond to something that made them angry on someone else's behalf, and choosing to be useful instead. "I'll be there at 8:30, she said. He thanked her and hung up and went back to Section 14, subsection C, and read it again. He was not done. Raina was right about that, but the road between here and harvest had just gotten considerably narrower, and whatever was on the other side of the county inspection, whatever the surveyor found, whatever the official reading of the boundary turned out to be, he was going to need more than the orchard and the bees. He was going to need people. He had not been good, in the years since Bettina died, at needing people. He supposed it was time to get better at it. Marlo arrived at 8:40 which was 10 minutes later than she'd said, and still faster than most people would have managed after a full day running a diner. She pulled up the lane with her headlights cutting through the late August dark and got out carrying a thermos and a folder, which told Gideon she'd spent some part of her evening thinking rather than just driving over. He'd set 2 folding chairs on the equipment shed's covered porch, where a single bulb threw yellow light over the concrete pad. She sat down, poured 2 cups from the thermos, and opened the folder on her knee. "I looked up section 14 when I got home," she said. He stared at her. "You read the County Agricultural Code, subsection C specifically, and the definitions section, because the definitions change how you read subsection C." She turned a printed page toward him. She'd highlighted 3 sections in yellow. "You said the complaint claims 7 clusters are within 300 feet of the property line." "That's what it says. Subsection C says 300 feet from the nearest occupied dwelling on an adjoining property, not from the property line." She tapped the highlighted text. "Those are 2 different measurements." Gideon took the page from her and read it. Then he read it again. He had read section 14 himself for 4 hours that afternoon, and he had found 3 things the complaint hadn't accounted for. This was not one of them. This was a 4th thing, and it was larger than any of the 3 he'd found. "If it's measured from the nearest dwelling," he said slowly, "then the south cluster setback isn't from the fence line. It's from the Kimmel's farmhouse, which is about 600 feet from your south fence, based on the county property records I pulled online." She pulled another printed page from the folder. "I'm not a surveyor. I might be reading the parcel map wrong, but if I'm not, your south cluster is compliant." He sat back in the chair. The single bulb hummed above them. From somewhere in the dark orchard, the bees were a faint, constant sound. The nighttime hum that he'd gotten used to the way you get used to a clock in a room. Present, but no longer intrusive. "That's the definition," he said. "That's what the complaint is exploiting. Whoever filed it is betting I'd read property line when the code says occupied dwelling. Or betting the county inspector would," Marlowe said. "If you walk in there not knowing the difference, the inspector measures from the fence line, and you lose 25 hives automatically." He looked at her in the yellow light. She was drinking her coffee, her expression the particular calm of someone who is more useful than they usually get credit for being. "You found this in an hour," he said. "I had a specific thing to look for. You were reading the whole code trying to find everything. Different task." She picked up her cup. "You need a lawyer to look at it. Someone who knows agricultural code, not just someone from town. This is too important to take on your word or mine." "I know." He'd been thinking about who to call. "There's a woman in Harlan County, Sandra Pruitt. She handled a water rights case for the Delacroix farm 3 years ago. Someone gave me her name. Call her tomorrow morning." "I will." He looked at the folder still open on her knee. "You drove out here at 8:30 with highlighted county code. Micah gets his research habits from somewhere." She said it simply, not inviting any particular response, and closed the folder. "What else did you find?" "The 3 things you mentioned," he told her. The first was that the complaint cited hive density using a formula that applied to urban classifications under the county code, not agricultural zones. The Hale property was zoned agricultural, which had no density restriction. The second was that 2 of the 7 cited clusters were on the western boundary, and the adjoining property there was county road easement, not private property. The code specified adjoining private property. The third was a filing procedural issue that might not hold up but was worth raising. Marlowe listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So, between what you found and what I found," she said, "the complaint is either misreading the code or deliberately exploiting ambiguous language." "Yes. Either way, if the inspector comes out without you being prepared, you lose hives before harvest. That's the timeline. Inspection is in 3.5 weeks. Harvest starts the week after." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I want to suggest something that you're going to resist." "Tell me anyway." "Open the orchard before the inspection." She held his gaze. "Let people come see it. Not a formal event. Nothing with a sign-up sheet. Just open the gate and tell Marlowe's and the hardware store and whoever else will spread the word that the orchard is open on Saturdays, come take a look. Let people walk the rows, see the hives, see the fruit. Let them form their own opinion based on what they see with their eyes instead of what they've been hearing secondhand." He looked at her. "You think that changes the inspection outcome?" I think county inspectors in small counties are human beings who live in those counties, she said. I think if half the town has walked through this orchard and watched the bees and tasted an apple off the tree, the conversation around that inspection is different than if you're just a guy with a complaint filed against him. She paused. And I think there are people in Cedar Hollow who would show up to help move hives if it came to that, but they can't help what they don't know about. Gideon turned this over. He was a private man, had been his whole life, and more so since Bettina died, and the idea of opening the property to whoever wanted to walk through it landed awkwardly against something deep in his nature. This was his land, his family's land. The work he'd done here for the last 6 months had been done alone, or nearly alone, and there was a part of him that wanted to defend it the same way, on his own terms, with his own arguments, in front of the inspector. But he was also 61 years old, and he'd watched enough things fail to know the difference between dignity and stubbornness. You're right that I was going to resist it, he said. I know. How much time would we need to organize it? First Saturday would be a week from this one. That's 10 days before the inspection. She picked up her thermos. I can handle the word of mouth from the diner. Micah wants to make a map of the orchard to hand out. I'm not even slightly joking. He drew a draft this afternoon. Gideon sat back in the chair and looked at the dark edge of the orchard where it met the sky. The stars were out again, the same aggressive clarity as the night after the storm. He thought about what Bettina would have said, and he thought she would have said something similar to what Marlowe was saying, and probably sooner. All right, he said. Let's open the orchard. Hey. He called Sandra Pruitt the next morning at 8 o'clock, and she called him back at 10:15, and they talked for 45 minutes. She asked clear questions and listened to the answers without filling the silences, and at the end she said, Send me the letter, your property survey, and the relevant sections of the code with the definitions. Give me 2 days. 2 days later, she called back. The complaint is poorly constructed, she said. The urban density formula is a clear misapplication. That alone would get the density issue dismissed. The road easement argument on the western clusters is solid. The dwelling measurement question is the most significant issue, and based on your survey, it appears to favor you. But I'd want a licensed surveyor to confirm the distances before you walk into that inspection. I've got a surveyor scheduled for Friday, Gideon said. Good. Get me the results as soon as you have them. She paused. Did you get any sense of who filed the complaint? No name on the letter. You have suspicions. I have one specific suspicion and I can't prove it. Keep it to yourself for now. If this goes to a formal hearing, which I don't think it will based on the code issues, then we deal with attribution then. She was efficient in the way of someone who billed by the hour and didn't consider that a reason to be unpleasant. Your strongest position is to walk into that inspection fully compliant on every point with documentation and let the code speak for itself. Don't make it about who filed it. I understand that. Do you? He almost smiled. It would feel better to make it about who filed it. Yes, it would, she said. Do it anyway. But the first Saturday opening brought 31 people. Gideon had not expected that. He'd put the number in his head at 15, maybe 20 if the weather was good, and spent the preceding week in a low-grade anxiety about whether anyone would actually come and whether those who did would trample something or disturb the hives or ask the kind of question he didn't know how to answer politely. He'd recruited Raina to be present, partly for practical reasons, and partly because having someone knowledgeable to field bee questions would keep him from having to perform extroversion for extended periods. Marlowe arrived at 8 in the morning with Micah, who had made 23 copies of the orchard map on the library's printer, hand-drawn, genuine, with each hive cluster marked and labeled, and a small compass rose in the corner that he'd clearly been proud of. He stood at the gate handing them out with the focused professionalism of a person who had found his role and intended to execute it well. People arrived in ones and twos starting at 9. Ray Bledsoe and his wife came first, which surprised Gideon. Ray was on the Historical Society and had been farming the county for 50 years and had, as far as Gideon knew, no particular opinion about any of this. But he walked the east row with his hands behind his back and looked at the old Roxbury trees with an expression of recognition. Mom, my father talked about these trees, Ray said. He bought apples from your grandfather. Said they were different from anything else in the county. They are different, Gideon said. I'd forgotten how much until this year. Ray pulled one of the smaller Roxbury apples off a low branch. Gideon had made clear that people were welcome to pick from the lower branches, and bit into it. He chewed for a moment without saying anything. "Lord," he said softly. Gideon let that stand. The librarian came, and 2 families with children who had heard through the school network that there were bees, and 4 farmers from the surrounding area, including one who drove in from Millhaven, specifically because he had apple trees of his own that had been declining for several years. He walked the orchard with Raina for over an hour, asking questions in the focused, hungry way of someone who had found the missing piece to a problem they'd been carrying around. Raina handed him her card before he left. Dale Kimmel arrived just before noon. He came alone without his wife, which meant this was deliberate and not a family outing. He walked through the south section the complaint specifically targeted, and stood near the cluster of hives along the fence line and looked at them for a while, and then looked at the Kimmel farmhouse, which was visible from that spot as a white shape through the tree line about 600 feet away. Gideon came to stand nearby. He didn't say anything first. Dale said, "You've measured the distance from here to my place?" "Yes, and it's 614 feet to your front porch. The surveyor confirmed it Friday." He paused. "The code requires 300 feet from the nearest occupied dwelling on an adjoining property, not from the property line." Dale absorbed this. He looked at the hive cluster, at the activity around the entrances, the constant, orderly stream of foragers going and coming in the late morning warmth. He'd lived next to bees for 3 months and had not been stung once, which Gideon knew because he'd been watching for any indication otherwise. "I didn't file that complaint," Dale said. "I know," Gideon said, and he did know. "I want you to know I know about it, and I didn't. I believe you." Dale looked at the hives for another moment. "I'm going to tell whoever asks me that this operation is being run responsibly, for what it's worth." "It's worth something," Gideon said. They shook hands at the edge of the south cluster, 2 neighbors who had known each other for 30 years and had been awkward with each other for 6 months, in the uncomplicated way of men who don't need to narrate the resolution of a thing. Just acknowledge it and move on. By early afternoon, there were people Gideon didn't know by name, people who had heard from people who had heard from other people, which was the exact mechanism Marlowe had been counting on when she'd suggested this. A young couple who ran a farm stand 2 towns over and were interested in the honey. A retired teacher who grew up in Cedar Hollow and hadn't been to the orchard since she was a girl. 3 teenagers who had come because Micah had told someone at school, and who spent most of their time taking photographs on their phones with the absorbed concentration of their generation, and who were, to Gideon's faint surprise, genuinely careful around the hives, following Raina's instructions about slow movement and no swatting with the seriousness of people who had been told something interesting and wanted to do it right. Micah moved through the whole day with the ease of someone who had been here so many times it was territory he owned. He walked people through the map he'd drawn, explaining the hive clusters and the apple varieties with the particular pleasure of a person sharing something they know thoroughly. He was 12 years old, and he talked about pollination dynamics and Roxbury russets and honey supermanagement with the casual fluency of someone who had spent a significant portion of his summer in this orchard, which was accurate. At one point, Gideon found himself standing near the old Roxbury trees watching Micah explain colony collapse disorder to Ray Bledsoe's wife, who was listening with the rapt attention of a woman encountering something she hadn't known she'd find fascinating. Raina appeared beside him. "That kid's going to do something with this," she said. "With what?" "All of it. The bees, the science, the—" She gestured at Micah, who was now demonstrating the waggle dance with unself-conscious accuracy. "The whole thing. It's already in him." Gideon watched the boy move his body in the figure-8 pattern of a forager bee reporting a food source to the hive, watched Ray Bledsoe's wife laugh, and then realize it wasn't a joke and stop laughing and start listening harder. "His mother's going to have a lot to say about career counseling," he said. "Probably," Raina said. She watched for another moment. 30-some people today. How do you feel about it?" He considered the question honestly. "Better than I expected to," he said. "Worse than I'll admit to most people." "Good answer." The surveyor's report confirmed Sandra Pruitt's reading of the code on every point that mattered. The south cluster setback to the Kimmel's dwelling, 614 feet. The western cluster's proximity to county road easement, not private property. The measurements, recorded officially and in writing, were what the letter of Section 14, subsection C, required them to be. Sandra submitted the response to the county office 6 days before the inspection. Gideon spent those 6 days doing what he'd been doing all summer, working the orchard, checking the hives, writing in the notebook, watching the honey crisps deepen toward the color Raina called ready. The apples on the old Roxbury trees were doing what Roxbury apples do in late August, which was to stop growing and start concentrating, pulling whatever sugar and complexity was in them inward, becoming denser and more themselves. They were not beautiful. They were lumpy and brown russeted and inconsistent in size, and they looked like something you'd pass over in a grocery store produce section without a second glance. They tasted like nothing you could get in a grocery store. He also spent those 6 days quietly accepting help that he was still not good at accepting. Ray Bledsoe called and offered his flatbed truck for hive transport, if it came to it. He didn't ask whether it would be needed. He just said the truck was available, and he'd be ready on short notice. The farmer from Millhaven, whose name was Pete Granger, called to ask if he could bring 2 of his farmhands on the day of any potential hive relocation. He had experience moving hives from his own early years, he said, and he'd heard through Raina that there might be a need. 4 other people called or stopped by the diner and left word with Marlowe, which became the unofficial message relay, which was a role Marlowe accepted without commenting on. By the day before the inspection, Gideon had, without organizing it, without asking for it directly, without making a single speech, assembled something that looked, if you squinted at it right, like a community response to a problem that had started as one man's private disaster. He didn't know what to do with that feeling exactly. He held it somewhere in his chest and tried not to examine it too closely. The second Saturday opening, 4 days before the inspection, brought 58 people. Gideon stood at the gate at noon watching them move through the rows. Families, farmers, a few people from the next county over who had read something online, the librarian again, the retired teacher who had come back and this time brought her sister, and felt something he didn't have a precise name for. Not pride exactly, though pride was in there. Something less self-regarding than pride. Something that had more to do with the trees than with himself. Marlowe came to stand beside him. She had flour on her apron from having baked a batch of apple hand pies that morning using Roxbury apples from the lower branches, which she'd been selling at the diner all week as a soft preview, and which had, she reported, generated more conversation than anything she'd put on the menu in 2 years. 58 people, she said. I counted. That's 0.5% of the county population. That's a funny way to frame it. That's the way it matters. 0.5% of a county showing up on a Saturday for an apple orchard is significant. She watched a family with 3 children stop in front of the old Roxbury tree, the smallest child reaching up for a low apple and just barely getting there. The inspection is Thursday. Yes. How do you feel? He thought about it. Sandra Pruitt had done her job. The surveyor had done his job. The code was what it was, and what it was appeared to be on his side, tight. He had documentation of everything, organized in the manila folder sitting on his kitchen table, and he had a lawyer who would be available by phone during the inspection if needed. He still had $38,000 in bees on this property, and a harvest that was days away from being the largest the orchard had ever produced in his lifetime, and a formal complaint designed to dismantle it hanging over the whole thing like weather. Like a man waiting for a verdict he thinks is in his favor, he said, which is still waiting. Marlowe nodded. Fair. She looked at the 58 people in the orchard. For what it's worth, I don't think the inspector is going to walk into a property that half the county has just personally visited and decide to make an enemy of everyone who was there. That's not how the law works. No, she said, but it's how people work. The county inspector's name was Arthur Venn, and he arrived Thursday morning at 9 o'clock in a county pickup truck. He was in his mid-50s, methodical, with the manner of a man who had done this job long enough to have encountered most of what people were capable of, both the violations and the defenses. Gideon met him at the gate. He shook hands and offered coffee, which Venn accepted. They stood for a moment at the edge of the orchard, and Venn looked at the rows of heavily laden trees and the white hive boxes distributed through them, and the bees moving through the morning air in their constant, purposeful thousands. This is a substantial operation, Venn said, not approvingly or disapprovingly, just observing. Yes, sir. You've had an inspection response prepared through an attorney? Sandra Pruitt out of Harlan County. You should have received it Tuesday. I did. Ven set down his coffee and took out a clipboard. Walk me through it. They walked the property for 90 minutes. Gideon showed him the surveyor's measurements, the official boundary markers, the GPS coordinates of each hive cluster relative to the Kimmel's dwelling and to the road easement. He showed him the county zoning classification documentation, agricultural, not urban, which invalidated the density formula the complaint had used. He showed him everything, in the order Sandra had suggested, without editorializing and without once saying the word complaint with any particular inflection. Ven measured. He wrote on his clipboard. He asked 4 questions, 2 of which were procedural and 2 of which were genuine, the kind a man asks when he's actually trying to understand something rather than build a case. At one point, he stopped near the south cluster and looked at the hives and then looked in the direction of the Kimmel farmhouse through the tree line. 614 to the nearest dwelling, he said. Yes, sir, confirmed by the licensed survey. Ven made a note. He looked at the hives for another moment. These are healthy colonies. They are. Who's your beekeeper of record? Raina Cross, she's my consulting beekeeper. Been involved since the operation started in April. I know Raina's work. He made another note. Her management records are in the documentation? Tab 4. Ven found tab 4, read for a moment, and closed the folder. He looked around at the orchard, at the rows of trees heavy with fruit, at the bees moving through the late morning light, at the 43 acres of what had been, 6 months ago, a property everyone in Cedar Hollow had quietly agreed was finished. Mr. Hale, he said, based on the survey documentation and the applicable definitions in Section 14, I'm not finding a violation. Gideon kept his face even. All right. The density formula cited in the complaint doesn't apply to your zoning classification. The western cluster setbacks are from county easement, not private property. The southern cluster is compliant under the dwelling measurement standard. He ticked through it with the tone of a man making sure the record was clear. I'll note in my report that the operation is in full compliance with Cedar Hollow Township Code as of the date of this inspection. I appreciate that. Ven looked at him with the particular expression of a county official who has been around long enough to know what he's actually looking at. This is a serious apple operation, he said. When's harvest? Week after next, if the weather holds. Ven nodded. He handed back the documentation folder. Good luck with it. He shook Gideon's hand, picked up his coffee, and walked back toward his truck. Gideon stood at the edge of the south cluster and listened to the truck pull down the lane and turn onto the county road and fade away down the hill toward town. Around him, the bees were doing what they'd been doing since April. The same constant, purposeful hum, indifferent to inspection results and legal arguments, and the opinions of Cedar Hollow, moving through the trees in the morning light with the simple intention of gathering what was there to be gathered. He took out his phone and called Sandra Pruitt. In compliance on all points, he said when she answered. Of course you are, she said. You did everything right. He called Raina next. She said, good, in a way that made clear she'd expected nothing else, and then asked him about the Northwest Cluster's inspection notes, because that was more immediately useful to her. He called Marlowe last. She answered on the second ring, and when he told her, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, come have lunch, and hung up before he could tell her he had work to do. He drove into town. He ate lunch. The harvest was 10 days away, and the orchard was still standing, and the bees were still working, and whatever Cedar Hollow was going to make of all of it was still being decided, not in the county office, and not in the diner, and not in anyone's particular conversation, but in the slow accumulating way that small communities revise their understanding of things they thought they already knew. The first apple Gideon Hale picked on harvest morning was a Roxbury russet from the old corner tree, Chut, the one his grandfather had planted in 1931, the one that had stood through 93 years of frost and drought and 11 years of silence and one very bad August storm. He picked it before anyone else arrived, before the trucks and the extra hands and the organized noise of a real harvest day, while the orchard was still in that particular pre-dawn quiet that belongs only to the person who got there first. He turned it over in his hands. It was not pretty. It was lumpy and russeted and roughly the size of a large fist, brown gold on one side and greenish on the other where it had been in the shade. There was a small bruise near the stem end from where it had rubbed against a neighboring apple on the same branch. He bit into it without ceremony. The flavor hit the back of his mouth the way the taste of something from childhood hits. Not gradually, but all at once, the way memory works when it's stored in the body rather than the mind. Sharp and sweet, and that complicated undertone that Raina had called nutty, and that he thought was closer to something earthier than that, something that had to do with the age of the rootstock and the particular mineral content of this hillside and decades of weather this specific piece of ground had absorbed. It tasted like this orchard, like the specific fact of this place. He stood there in the early dark and ate the apple down to the core, and he thought about his grandfather, who he had never met but whose hands had cleared the ground he was standing on. He thought about his father, who had walked these rows with him before Gideon was old enough to understand what he was being shown. He thought about Bettina in her green jacket, who had known this land the way you know a person you've lived alongside for decades. Not perfectly, not completely, but in the deep and specific way that comes from years of daily attention. He thought about 11 years of blossoms falling into nothing. 11 years of walking these rows with the low-grade grief of a man watching something he loves slowly fail, not knowing why, not knowing if the failure was the trees or the land or himself. He threw the core into the grass. He went to get his gloves. Harvest at the Hale Orchard that September was not the elegant, cinematic affair that people imagine when they picture an apple harvest. It was work, physical, repetitive, demanding work. And it started at 6:30 in the morning and ran until the light gave out. And it was complicated by the sheer volume of what the trees had produced and the fact that Gideon had never in his farming life managed a harvest of this scale alone. He wasn't alone. Pete Granger arrived at 6 with 2 farmhands, as he'd promised. Ray Bledsoe brought his flatbed and his wife, who turned out to be faster at picking than anyone else on the property and who organized the sorting operation at the equipment shed with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for someone to ask. Dale Kimmel came on the second day and worked without being thanked effusively for it, which was what he wanted. The librarian came on the Saturday of the first week and brought 4 people from a regional agricultural preservation group who asked careful questions and picked a combined 800 pounds of apples and left with Raina's card and a jar of honey each. Micah was there every day that school allowed, which meant afternoons and both weekend days and one day in the middle of the week that Marlowe said she didn't ask too many questions about. He worked harder than most adults, with the particular energy of a 13-year-old who has found the thing they want to be doing and resents any hour spent doing something else. He hauled picking bags and sorted fruit and ran the tablet Gideon used for yield tracking, updating the numbers with a focus that Raina said quietly made her want to hire him. Marlowe came when she could, which was less than she would have liked and more than she had time for, and she brought food every time, not as performance, not as a statement, just because she understood that a harvest crew works longer when someone has thought about lunch. By the end of the first week, the yield numbers were forcing Gideon to revise his projections upward in a way that felt reckless to trust, so he revised them conservatively. And then the numbers kept coming in above even the conservative revision. And on the 8th day of harvest, Micah looked at the tablet and said, "At this rate, you're going to hit 8,000 bushels." Gideon said, "Don't say that. I'm just reading the numbers." "I know. Don't say it." Micah looked at him with the expression of someone deciding whether to argue, then looked at the numbers again, then back at Gideon. "Okay," he said, "but you should look at the numbers." He looked at the numbers that evening at the kitchen table, alone with the second notebook and a cup of coffee that went cold while he wasn't paying attention to it. The final harvest came in at 8,241 bushels. He sat with that number for a long time. The record for the Hale Orchard, set in 1962 according to his father's ledger, was 7,890 bushels. He went to the back room and got his father's ledger from the filing cabinet. Not the drawer of his desk where he kept the good ledger, the one he never opened, but the operational one from the cabinet. And he opened it to 1962 and looked at the number written there in his father's careful handwriting, 7,890. He put it back. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a while thinking about things he could not have said out loud to anyone without embarrassing himself. And then he slept better than he had in 6 months. Harvey Boone came to the orchard on a Saturday morning in the second week of October, 3 weeks after harvest ended, The trees were bare of fruit by then, stripped clean and beginning their own quieting down for the season. The leaves going yellow and rust, and that particular dark red that apple trees go in autumn. The hives were still active. The bees would work as long as the temperature permitted, pulling in late-season pollen from the wildflower strips and the surrounding landscape, building their winter stores. But the summer's intensity had settled into something more deliberate, slower, the colony shifting its priorities from expansion to endurance. Gideon was at the equipment shed doing the first of the equipment cleaning that would run through November when he heard the truck on the gravel lane. He recognized it by sound before he turned around, which told him something about the specific texture of dread that Harvey Boone's visits had acquired over the past several months. He put down the tool he was holding and waited. Harvey got out of the truck slowly, which was not how Harvey usually moved. He stood by the cab for a moment, looking at the stripped trees and the hive boxes and the stone wall and the long grass of the orchard floor, which was going golden in the October morning. Then he walked toward the shed with his hands in his pockets and stopped about 10 feet away. "I heard the yield numbers," he said. "Word gets around. 8,000 plus bushels." He said it without inflection, just the number. "Yes." Harvey looked at the nearest row of trees. He was quiet for longer than Harvey Boone was usually quiet, which itself was something. He had a face that was not easy to read, the face of a man who had spent decades making decisions in public and had learned to control what crossed it. But there was something there this morning that wasn't Harvey's usual register, something that looked, on a face that didn't practice it much, like it cost him something to be here. "The complaint was mine," Harvey said. Gideon didn't say anything. "I filed it in August, after the storm." Harvey looked at him directly now, the way Harvey always looked at things. Straight on, no flinching. "I told myself it was a legitimate concern. The hive count, the proximity to the road, the regulations. I told myself I was doing the county a service." "Were you?" Harvey's jaw tightened. "No." He said it flat and clean and without the hedging that would have made it easier for him. "I was doing myself a service, or what I thought was a service." He looked away at the trees again. "I'd told people you were going to fail. I'd said it since March. In the feed store, at the grain elevator, to anyone who'd listen. I had a position on record, and the orchard was proving it wrong, and I—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I'm not going to make excuses for it. It was wrong. It was a wrong thing to do." Gideon had known since the night of the letter. Not certainly. He hadn't been certain until Harvey walked up to him just now and said it. But he'd known the way you know things in small towns when you've lived in them long enough. The timing, the anonymous filing, the specific exploitation of the measurement ambiguity. Only a man who'd been following the operation closely enough to find the technical weakness would have thought to look for it there. Harvey was a smart man. That had never been his problem. "You almost cost me 25 hives 10 days before harvest," Gideon said. "I know that. After a storm that already hit us hard." "I know." The morning was very quiet. A woodpecker was working somewhere in the east tree line, its drilling carrying clearly in the October air. The bees were audible from the nearest cluster, that constant hum that Gideon now heard as naturally as he heard the wind. Harvey reached into his jacket pocket and took out an envelope and held it out. Gideon looked at it without taking it. "What's that?" "The cost of the surveyor," Harvey said. "And Sandra Pruitt's bill. Marlowe told me what they ran." "Marlowe told you?" "She didn't mean any harm by it. She thought—" He stopped. "I asked her. I asked her directly what this cost you. She told me." Gideon looked at the envelope. He thought about $38,000 and a storm and an inspection and 6 months of work. He thought about Harvey standing in this orchard in June saying, "That's more fruit than I've seen on this property in a while," with the specific reluctance of a man who'd rather not admit it. He thought about what it cost Harvey Boone to stand here this morning with an envelope in his hand and say what he'd said. "Keep your money," Gideon said. Harvey's expression shifted. "Gideon, I'm not interested in the money." He meant it. He'd spent the money and absorbed it, and it was part of the cost of the year, and he was done thinking about it. "I'm interested in whether you understand why what you did was wrong. Not that it failed, that it was wrong before you knew whether it would fail." Harvey was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, I understand that. Because you had a position and someone was threatening your position. Yes. And you decided your position mattered more than what was true. Harvey didn't answer immediately. He looked at the orchard, at the stripped trees, at the hives, at the stone wall his grandfather had never built, but that Gideon's grandfather had. At the ground that this family had tended for 90 years, while Harvey Boone's family had watched from 300 acres of corn and soybeans and told everyone what was practical. Yes, Harvey said again. It was quieter this time. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. Harvey was 64 years old. He would not become a different kind of man. That was not what this was about, and it was not something Gideon had any interest in engineering. People were mostly what they were, and the space between a wrong thing done and a wrong thing acknowledged was real, even if everything else stayed the same. He went into the equipment shed and came back with 2 apples, not the Honeycrisps, not the Cortlands, but 2 Roxbury Russets, lumpy and brown gold and improbable. He held one out to Harvey. Harvey looked at it. He took it. They stood at the edge of the orchard in the October morning and ate the apples without talking. Harvey finished his and looked at what was left of it with an expression Gideon couldn't fully read. That's something, Harvey said. Yes. I've never had one like that. Most people haven't. Gideon finished his own apple and threw the core into the grass. My grandfather planted those trees in 1931. Nobody's been able to taste what they were supposed to produce for 11 years. He looked at the row of old Roxburys, bare now, resting, storing up for next season. It was never the trees that were wrong. Harvey nodded slowly. He put the apple core in his jacket pocket, a small, fastidious habit that Gideon had never noticed in him before. He put the envelope back in his pocket too. I'll find another way to make it right, he said. If you'll let me. Gideon thought about it. Talk to Pete Granger, he said. He's got apple trees on his property that are struggling for the same reason mine were. He doesn't have the resources to do what I did. A man with 300 acres of corn and soybeans talking to the county cooperative about pollinator habitat would carry more weight than I do. Harvey looked at him. Something in his expression shifted into a new configuration. You want me to advocate for... I want you to use the thing you're actually good at, Gideon said, which is convincing other farmers in this county that something is practical. That's what you do. You've been doing it your whole life. He held Harvey's gaze, pointed at the right problem. Harvey was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's a bigger ask than the envelope. I know it is. Harvey looked at the orchard. He nodded once, not enthusiastically, not with the warmth of a man who has been transformed, but with the deliberate acknowledgement of a person accepting a fair exchange. All right, he said. I'll talk to Granger. He got in his truck and left. Gideon watched the truck go down the lane and turn onto the county road and disappear behind the tree line. And he stood there for a while after, not thinking about Harvey in particular, just thinking about how the worst things people do to each other are usually not done out of malice, but out of the need to have been right. And how the distance between I need to have been right and I was wrong was one of the hardest distances a person could cross. And how crossing it was worth something even if it didn't fix everything. And how not asking for more than someone could give was itself a kind of skill it had taken him most of his life to develop. He went back to cleaning equipment. The honey went on sale at Marlowe's Diner on the first Saturday in November, in 4-ounce and 8-ounce jars with a simple label that Micah had designed. The word Haile in clean block letters over a drawing of the old Roxbury tree that was accurate enough that anyone who'd been to the orchard would recognize it immediately. Marlowe had ordered 40 jars to start, which she'd told Gideon was conservative. She sold out by noon. She called him from the diner at 12:15. I need more jars, she said. I told you 40 wasn't enough. You said 50. I said 60. A pause. Bring 60, and maybe more. I have people asking. He brought 60 that afternoon, and she sold 38 of them before closing time and put the remainder behind the counter with a hand-lettered card that said, Hail Orchard Honey, back in stock weekly. The following Saturday, she took 80 jars and ran through them by 2 in the afternoon, and she called him again and he told her he'd been thinking about the right pricing structure, and she told him she'd already adjusted it twice based on what people were willing to pay, and that they needed to have a real conversation about regional distribution because she'd had 2 inquiries from farm stands in adjacent counties. The honey was, objectively, Very good. Gideon knew this not because he'd decided it was good, but because Raina had told him, with her characteristic lack of unnecessary encouragement, that the floral diversity of the orchard and the surrounding wildflower strips had produced something with a complexity that most monoculture honey operations couldn't match. It wasn't one flavor. It was layered. The apple blossom was the dominant note, but underneath it were the clover and the borage and whatever the bees had found in the wood's edge that he hadn't planted and hadn't accounted for. It tasted like this specific place at this specific point in its life, which was, it turned out, exactly what certain people were willing to pay for. Micah reported this finding one afternoon at the kitchen table, having apparently conducted his own informal market research at school. People like things that are from somewhere specific, he said. Like, when I tell them the honey is from an orchard in Cedar Hollow that was about to die and now it's producing more than it ever has. They want to try it. It's not just honey, it's a story. Gideon looked at him across the table. You've been telling people about the orchard. Everyone already knows. I'm just telling it better. This was true enough that Gideon couldn't argue with it. The orchard had become something in Cedar Hollow that he hadn't anticipated and couldn't entirely account for. A topic of conversation, a local point of reference, the kind of thing that enters a small community's story of itself and stays. People who had walked through it on the Saturday openings talked about it to people who hadn't been. The apple hand pies at Marlowe's had become a weekly fixture. Pete Granger had started asking questions about bees for his own property, and Ray Bledsoe had told 3 people that he'd eaten a Roxbury russet in October for the first time and hadn't stopped thinking about it since. None of it was a transformation. Cedar Hollow was still Cedar Hollow, still the same 1,100 people, same grain elevator, same 2 churches, same 3-member historical society meeting in Norma Bledsoe's parlor on the 2nd Tuesday of every month. Harvey Boone had called Pete Granger as he'd said he would, and they'd had a conversation that Harvey described to Gideon in a subsequent exchange as useful, which from Harvey was a significant endorsement. The conversation at the county cooperative about pollinator habitat corridors was ongoing, which meant it was happening, which was more than it had been. Small things, slow things, the kind of change that doesn't announce itself. On the last evening in November, Gideon walked the orchard after dark. He did this sometimes, not often, not as a ritual, just occasionally when the day had settled, and he wanted to be in the rows without anything to do in them. The hives were in their winter configuration, the bees clustered inside the boxes generating heat, the entrances reduced, the whole operation pulled inward and enduring the way living things endure winter. Not dead, not even fully dormant, just patient. The trees were bare and dark against the cold sky, the same trees his grandfather had planted and his father had expanded and that everyone in Cedar Hollow had agreed, at various points in the last decade, were done. He thought about the question Micah had asked him in April, on a morning when the blossoms were out and the orchard was beautiful and completely useless. Why don't any bees come here? It was such a small question. It was the smallest kind of question. A child noticing an absence, naming it, handing it to an adult without understanding what the adult would do with it. And what Gideon had done with it was spend $38,000 and 6 months of the hardest work of his late life and weather a storm and a legal complaint and the sustained skepticism of most people he'd known for decades. He had done all of that for an absence. He had invested everything he had left in filling a silence he hadn't known was there until a boy in rubber boots walked into his orchard and named it. There was something in that worth sitting with. The idea that the most important diagnosis is often the simplest one. The one that requires not expertise, but attention. The one that a person can only make if they haven't yet learned to stop looking at the thing everyone else has stopped looking at. Gideon had been farming for 40 years. He'd tested his soil and adjusted his irrigation and pruned his trees and studied his yields, and he had never once crouched in the grass and watched the blossoms and noticed that nothing was visiting them. He'd been too close. He'd been managing the problem instead of seeing it. That was the thing about being too deep inside your own situation. You lose the ability to ask the obvious question. You get so accustomed to the shape of your failure that it starts to look like the shape of the world. He'd needed a child with no preconceptions and rubber boots 2 sizes too large. He'd needed to be embarrassed by the simplicity of the answer. He thought about Harvey Boone, too, standing in the October morning with an envelope he hadn't accepted, eating a Roxbury apple with the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't expected to encounter. Harvey was not a villain. He was a man who'd gotten invested in being right and had done a bad thing to protect that investment, and he'd come back and said so. And that was not redemption exactly, not the dramatic kind that made for a satisfying arc, but it was something real. The real version of what people are capable of when they can bring themselves to cross the distance. What Gideon had found, in his 61st year, was that people were neither as bad as their worst moments, nor as good as they would like to believe they were. Harvey had filed a complaint that could have wrecked the harvest. Harvey had also shown up in October and said it was wrong. Both of those things were true, and neither of them canceled out the other. And the only thing you could do with that complexity was hold it without resolving it into something simpler. He stopped in front of the old Roxbury tree, the one from 1931, the one his grandfather had planted when he had less than nothing and was making something anyway. The tree was bare. The branches caught the faint moonlight in that particular way that bare branches do in winter, tracery against the sky, intricate and without excess, every unnecessary thing already fallen away. It would stand here through the cold and the ice and whatever the winter brought, and in April the blossoms would come back, and this time, for the first time in 12 years, the bees would be there to meet them. He put his hand on the bark. The tree was cold and solid under his palm, and it had been here longer than he had, and would probably be here after him, and it didn't know or care about county inspection reports or yield records or what Harvey Boone thought or what anyone in Cedar Hollow thought. It just kept doing what it did, reaching down into the ground and reaching up into the light and making what it could make from what it had. Maybe that was the whole lesson. Not the bees, not the honey, not the record harvest that people would talk about in Cedar Hollow for a while and eventually absorb into the fabric of what the town knew about itself. The lesson was the tree. The lesson was the thing that everyone had agreed was finished, standing in the dark in November, alive, root deep in ground it had occupied for 93 years, not requiring anyone's permission to still be here. He took his hand off the bark. He turned and walked back through the rows toward the house, where the kitchen light was on, because he'd learned since Bettina died to leave it on when he went out in the dark so there would be something to walk toward. Raina came out the following spring to help prepare the hives for the new season. She arrived in early April, the same canvas jacket, the same directness, and found Gideon already in the West Cluster, checking for winter losses with the focused attention of a man who has been doing this long enough to know what he's looking at. "How many losses?" she said. 11 hives didn't make it through. He said it matter-of-factly. 11 hives out of 200 was a winter attrition rate he'd researched and found to be, for a first-year operation in this climate, on the lower end of normal. "That's not bad," she said. "I know." He was already moving to the next cluster. "I've got replacement packages coming the 15th. Curtis available to help install?" "He is." She watched him work for a moment. "You're different," she said. He kept working. "How so?" "You know what you're doing now." She said it the way she said everything, as observation, not compliment. "Last spring you were counting every sting. Now you're just a beekeeper checking hives." He paused at the entrance of a strong colony, watching the early spring flight. Bees already going out on orientation flights, testing the warming air, carrying back the first pollen loads of the season, bright yellow and improbably hopeful against the still bare trees. "Is that what I am?" he said. "A beekeeper." Among other things, she came to look at the colony he was watching. "The blossoms start in 2 weeks, based on the buds I looked at coming up the lane. 10 days, I think? The Roxbury always goes first." She nodded. They stood at the hive entrance in the early April morning, and around them the orchard was doing its slow annual resurrection. The tight bud swell on every branch, the ground going soft under the warmth, the particular smell of early spring that is mostly mud and dormant wood, and the faint promise of something coming. Micah rode up on his bike at 7:30. He was 13 now, and he'd grown 3 inches since the previous April, which had not reduced the rubber boot problem because Marlowe had apparently given up trying to keep him in footwear that fit. He had a notebook under his arm. A new one, not the composition book with the bee drawing, something more organized with tabs. He dropped the kickstand and looked at the budding trees and the hive clusters and the 2 adults standing by the West Colony, and the expression on his face was the same one he'd had the first time the bees arrived. That specific, unguarded amazement of a person watching something that exceeds their expectation of the world. The buds are further along than last week, he said. 10 days, Gideon said, maybe less. Micah opened his notebook. He clicked his pen. I've been reading about the correlation between early spring temperature patterns and blossom timing in heritage apple varieties, he said. There's a study out of Vermont that might be applicable. Raina looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at Micah. Show me after you've looked at the East Cluster, he said. The number 4 hive has been light since February. I want a second opinion. Micah was already walking toward the East Cluster, notebook open, clicking his pen again. Raina watched him go. How old is he? 13. She looked at Gideon. You know what you've done here is bigger than the orchard, she said. You know that. He looked at the boy moving through the rows of budding apple trees, stopping at the 4th hive with his head tilted in the listening to the hive posture that took most beginners months to develop. He thought about the question that had started all of this. Why don't any bees come here? And the strange, improbable chain of events that question had set in motion. $38,000 and a storm and a legal complaint and a record harvest and a neighbor standing in October with an envelope he wouldn't take and the old Roxbury trees bearing more fruit than they had in living memory. And a boy who would carry something forward from all of it, who would go wherever he went with bees and apple trees and pollination dynamics, and the memory of this orchard in the specific and formative way that a person carries the place where they first understood something important about how the world actually works. I know, Gideon said. He put on his veil and went to join the boy at the 4th hive, where the bees were already coming alive in the warming April morning, already doing what they had always done and would keep doing long after all of them were gone, finding the bloom, carrying what needed to be carried, making something from what was there. The orchard waited. The buds held. And in 10 days, maybe less, the blossoms would open and the bees would be there, and the silence that had lived in this place for so long would be, for another season, completely gone.